They thought it would be just another oversight hearing until Jasmine Crockett stepped into the room and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Pam Bondi, polished and poised, had dodged tough questions for years. But today, the truth wasn't coming quietly. With over 9 million Americans watching live, Crockett didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. She opened a plain red folder, and what came out of it shattered Bondi's reputation like glass under a gavel. One email, one witness, one line that ripped the curtain off a decade of hidden deals. By the end of the session, Pam Bondi wasn't deflecting anymore. She was drowning in silence. And just 24 hours later, the woman who once wore power like armor was staring down a federal subpoena. So if you believe justice still matters in America, especially when the system wants to bury it, hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with us. Because what you're about to see might just restore your faith in what truth can still do. They thought it would be just another oversight hearing. A Tuesday morning. Quiet, procedural, forgettable. But at 9 a.m., sharp, the doors to room 2141 swung open, and Washington changed. Jasmine Crockett didn't stride in with fanfare or flashing cameras. She didn't need to. She walked in like someone who knew exactly where the fault lines were buried, and came prepared to break the floor beneath them. Pam Bondi was already seated at the opposite end of the long, lacquered table, surrounded by silence and strategy. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her cream blazer crisp. Her diamond studs glittered under the harsh fluorescent lights. To the untrained eye, she looked like control. But to Jasmine, she looked like the end of pretending. The room filled slowly, almost reluctantly. Aides whispered. Reporters adjusted their recorders. One camera light flicked on early, like it felt something coming. Congressional hearing chambers are often sterile and ceremonial, but today it felt different. Heavier, charged, personal. The nameplate in front of Bondi read, Former Attorney General, State of Florida. But today that title was just a shield, and it was cracking. Jasmine sat down slowly, her eyes never leaving Bondi's. It wasn't anger in her gaze. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from years of watching people like Bondi rise through the system, not by upholding the law, but by bending it just enough to keep power smiling. Bondi blinked first. A quiet knock of the chairman's gavel broke the tension, but not the silence that had taken hold of the room. The Oversight Committee will now come to order, the chair announced. There were murmurs of protocol, formalities, swearing in, a brief opening statement. But Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to, because this wasn't about speeches. This was about a moment years in the making. Now here's what most people didn't see, not even the press. A soft flicker of Jasmine's fingers across the corner of a manila envelope, a glance toward a screen still blank, and the way her lips moved, not in a smirk, but in something quieter. A prayer, maybe. To older viewers watching at home, this wasn't politics. It was something closer to reckoning. Across the room, Bondi leaned back slightly. She'd been in dozens of hearings. She knew how to dodge, spin, charm, and retreat. She had survived national scandals. She'd been praised by former presidents. But today, something was off. It wasn't the cameras. It wasn't the evidence. It was Jasmine's silence. Bondi's opening remarks began. Smooth, practiced, cold. I'm honored to appear before the committee today, she said. I have always served the people of Florida with integrity. But she didn't finish the sentence with conviction, because across the room, Jasmine opened that envelope, and out came a single red folder, not thick, not bulky, but final. Older viewers who had followed political scandals for decades, from Watergate to Benghazi, know this moment. It's not when someone yells, it's when someone stops talking altogether and starts proving. And that's exactly what Jasmine did. She waited. Calm. Precise. Letting Bondi speak uninterrupted. Letting the rope unspool. Letting the room lean in. And then she tapped her mic. Just once. It wasn't a gavel. It wasn't a call to order. But it froze the air. Ms. Bondi, she began, her voice low. Nearly too low for the back row to hear. But that didn't matter. Because this wasn't for them. This was for history. You said you've always served the people of Florida, Jasmine continued, eyes fixed. I just have one question to start us off. Bondi looked up, Slight shift. Blink. Was the $25,000 donation from the Trump Foundation made before or after you declined to investigate Trump University? The air snapped. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't drama. It was surgical precision, the kind of question you only ask when you already know the answer. Bondi hesitated. Not for long, just a flicker, but enough. That donation, she said, clearing her throat, was part of a broader philanthropic effort that my office... Click. Jasmine hit the projector. On the screen, a scanned IRS Form 990, line 12C, Justice for All PAC, $25,000, September 2013. Date stamped, IRS verified. Directly connected, no ambiguity. The room stilled again, not out of respect, but recognition. Recognition that the game was no longer about words, it was about proof. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She looked across the room with the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen too many families go bankrupt, chasing justice they'd never get. You received that donation, she said, her tone flat, just 4 days before you declined to open a fraud investigation into Trump University. Bondi's face held still, too still, and then Jasmine leaned forward, eyes narrowing, not in malice, but in mission. My constituents can't afford $25,000 shields, she said. They can barely afford groceries. There it was, the crack, not in Bondi's story, in her presence, because for the first time, she didn't look like power. She looked like exposure. And then it happened. A voice from the back row, whispered at first, but caught on mic. Oh my God, she's got the email. All heads turned to Jasmine. She didn't flinch. She reached into her folder and pulled out a single printed document. 1 page. Top line, Trump U position statement. Middle line, AG Bondi will not pursue further action if campaign support is guaranteed. No paraphrase, no summary, the words themselves, typed by a staffer inside the Florida Attorney General's office, now entered into public record. Pam Bondi didn't speak. She didn't blink. Because there was no script for this, only truth, and its weight. Across the nation, older viewers watching on C-SPAN felt the stillness settle, because they'd seen this pattern before. Whispers, power, immunity. But now they were seeing what happens when someone refuses to play along. Jasmine stood, not dramatically, not defiantly, just enough. Mr. Chairman, she said, turning to the committee, I move to enter this document into the official record. The chairman nodded, slowly, deliberately, and just like that, the air inside room 2141 wasn't cold anymore. It was charged, because the moment had arrived, not of accusation, but of accountability. The document hadn't even cooled on the table before the first ripple hit. Not a gasp, not a scream, just a low, collective breath from the hearing room, a sound so small and human that it betrayed what the heart already knew. Jasmine Crockett had just detonated something permanent. On the projection screen behind her, the words hung like smoke in a courtroom. AG Bondi will not pursue further action if campaign support is guaranteed. There it was. No spin. No plausible deniability. No second draft of history. Just the blunt truth of influence traded for silence, typed by someone who thought no one would ever read it outside their inbox. For a moment, no one moved. Not Bondi, not the committee, not even the press pool trained to chase sound bites and scandals. Because this wasn't theater anymore. This was what the system feared most, clarity. Pam Bondi sat upright, frozen in place, her jaw tight, her fingertips pressed so hard into her notes that the paper began to crease beneath her nails. She didn't look at Jasmine. She didn't look at the screen. Her eyes scanned the room like a swimmer searching for the surface after staying under too long. But the surface was gone. Jasmine had drained the pool. Her voice, steady and low, broke the silence again. Not to gloat, not to punish, but to press. This wasn't just a donation, she said. It was an investment in immunity. And you, Ms. Bondi, were the return. Someone near the back, a staffer maybe, let out an audible exhale, and across the committee bench, pens were lowered. People weren't taking notes anymore. They were watching. Not with curiosity, but with something older, deeper, Recognition. Recognition that a mask had been removed, and underneath it wasn't a villain. It was something worse, a pattern. In living rooms across the country, especially in the homes of older Americans who had seen their trust betrayed time and again, remote controls froze mid-click. Coffee went cold. Veterans who had worn uniforms to defend this country from corruption abroad now sat silently, witnessing it unravel on their own soil. They'd seen the headlines before: donor money, PACs, favors, closed cases, but never like this. Never with this level of brutal surgical evidence. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just pulled the pin. She'd handed America the grenade and let them feel the weight for themselves. The chairman cleared his throat, perhaps to restore order, but the sound felt small, almost irrelevant. Even his authority had been swallowed by what was now on the record. "We will now enter a brief recess," he said, voice thin, already halfway drowned by the murmurs that erupted behind him. But Jasmine didn't move. She stood firm, both hands resting calmly on the red folder, now closed, but pulsing with significance. Bondi, on the other hand, did rise, but only halfway. She reached for her water, sipped too quickly, and tried to reclaim the mask that had cracked under the heat of evidence. But the mask no longer fit, and everyone in that room knew it. As the members of Congress stood and aides filed out, the cameras caught what would later become the freeze frame of a generation. A shot of Bondi's face, lit by the projector's glow, eyes empty, jaw clenched, while Jasmine stood beside her with the poise of a woman who had stopped asking the system to listen and instead made it witness. Social media exploded. Not with hashtags or hot takes, but with silence, screenshots, and the one sentence everyone repeated like a national reckoning: "If campaign support is guaranteed." It was more than a quote. It was a confession in slow motion. By noon, it had crossed 3 cable networks. By 1 p.m., it was on the front page of The Hill, Fox, MSNBC, and Politico. By 2 p.m., someone had painted it across a banner and hung it from the Capitol gates. Inside room 2141, the energy had shifted. People were no longer asking if Bondi would respond. They were asking how much she would admit, because the questions weren't coming anymore. The questions had been answered. What remained now was judgment. When the committee reconvened, the mood was different, tighter, heavier. Jasmine sat down without a word, without a glance at Bondi. Her job wasn't to destroy a woman. It was to expose a machine. And she'd done that. Now came the part that justice demanded, the follow-through. The chairman leaned forward, noticeably more deliberate than before. "Ms. Crockett," he said, "do you have further evidence to submit at this time?" Jasmine didn't speak. She simply slid the second document across the table. A copy of an internal calendar entry, handwritten, noting a private meeting between Bondi's team and a representative of presidential legal affairs. No name, no exact location. Just a time, a date, and a room that lined up with visitor logs already available to the public. Bondi's defense, that she had never personally been aware of any correlation, had just cracked again. This wasn't politics anymore. It was a sequence of doors, slowly creaking open. The camera zoomed in as Bondi's face began to harden, not in defiance, but in retreat. "That meeting," she said, her voice clipped, "was not related to any investigative matter." Jasmine waited a beat. "Then why did the meeting title include the word immunity?" Bondi froze. It was a word she hadn't expected anyone to find, a word that didn't come from legal documentation, but from the handwritten margins of someone who hadn't been cleaning their tracks, just trying to do their job. A junior staffer, a name Jasmine hadn't yet spoken aloud. "Mr. Chairman," Jasmine continued calmly, "I'd like to call our next witness." A rustle swept through the room. Bondi's eyes snapped up. "The witness is present and waiting in the adjoining chamber." The chairman looked to his counsel, who nodded. "Proceed." The side door creaked open, and in stepped someone no one expected. He didn't enter like someone seeking the spotlight. He walked in like someone carrying weight, years of it, the kind that bends a man's shoulders forward and keeps his eyes low, even under the glare of the national press. Evan Price had never been on camera before, not once. But now, every lens in room 2141 locked on him like heat-seeking missiles. He was average height, with thinning hair and a nervous stiffness to his movements. But the badge clipped to his lapel read something far more substantial than his appearance let on. Senior Legal Policy Analyst, Office of the Florida Attorney General, retired. Jasmine stood as he approached, not out of showmanship, but respect. She had never met this man in person until an hour earlier. He had come to her quietly through a back channel. No legal team, no fanfare. Just one question. If I tell the truth, will you protect me? The oath came first. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it, but his voice didn't crack, not even once. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? The clerk asked. I do. Those two words rang louder than anything that had come before them. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She allowed the silence to settle, because in that moment, the room knew. This wasn't going to be speculation. This wasn't going to be partisan. This was going to be firsthand. The kind of truth that doesn't hide in footnotes. The kind that comes from seeing too much for too long. Mr. Price, she said calmly, can you tell the committee where you were on September 2nd, 2013? A pause. He nodded slowly. I was in the Tallahassee office, 3rd floor, just outside the conference room we called Cabinet 6. That morning, I was instructed to clear the hall. By whom? Jasmine asked. A senior aide to AG Bondi. I won't name them unless compelled. That's acceptable, the chairman added, recognizing the risk. What happened next? Jasmine prompted. Evan exhaled. It wasn't just breath, it was memory uncoiling. 3 individuals entered the room. I recognized 2. One was AG Bondi herself. The other was a legal representative linked to the Trump organization. The third man remained unidentified, but wore a lapel pin denoting campaign operations. The chamber tensed. Bondi's face didn't flinch, but her grip on the armrest tightened just enough for cameras to catch it. Did you witness any part of the conversation? Jasmine asked. No, Evan replied. I was instructed not to be within earshot. But afterward, the senior aide returned and said, verbatim, the issue's going away. Bondi's got assurances now. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, but it was devastating. Because no matter how well written a denial is, it can't erase the tone of someone who was in the building when it happened. Jasmine looked down at her notes, then back at Evan. Did you document that statement? Yes, he said. I logged it in my end-of-day briefing notes. The internal system time-stamped it automatically. She raised a single sheet of paper and handed it to the committee clerk. I'm entering this into the record. The screen blinked to life again, a scanned memo. Timestamp, September 2nd, 2013. Subject, Trump U. Line 3, no further AG action anticipated per meeting W. Campaign side liaison. AG confirmed, internally. Bondi didn't speak. Her face had shifted into something unreadable, not defiance, not guilt, something more unsettling. A kind of stunned calculation, like a chess player realizing the board has already been lost. The room was still, save for the click of 100 keyboards transcribing every word. And somewhere behind the press row, a whisper finally slipped out. She can't survive this. Across the country, the clip of Evan Price taking the oath had already gone viral. Facebook was flooded with still frames of his weary expression. Twitter reposted the memo. Fox News ran a banner. Whistleblower confirms Trump donation linked to case dropped by Pam Bondi. Even CNN, cautious and fact-checking every syllable, ran with, witness, Bondi met privately with Trump campaign before decision. Yeechaw, but the most powerful response didn't come from headlines. It came from the comments, from grandmothers in Nebraska, from veterans in Ohio, from lifelong voters who had never watched a hearing before, but today sat silent, hearts pounding, saying, this is why we stopped trusting them. Inside the chamber, Bondi finally spoke, but not to refute the memo, not to deny the meeting. She went for the only card she had left. This, she said, her voice trembling with forced composure, is a political ambush. It's theater. It's coordinated slander meant to destroy my reputation. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply leaned forward, her eyes steady, and asked one question that struck like a bell. If it's theater, why is every prop time-stamped by your own office? Bondi blinked, once, and that was all Jasmine needed. She turned to Evan again. Do you believe justice was obstructed in that moment? I do, he said, no hesitation. And do you believe the decision not to pursue Trump University was influenced by political considerations? Without a doubt, he replied. I didn't have proof back then, but I knew something was off. I knew it in my gut. And now? Jasmine asked. Evan nodded toward the screen. Now I see it in black and white. The weight of those words settled into the air like fog over still water. No anger. No shouting. Just the slow realization that everything Bondi had spent years deflecting was now collapsing under sworn testimony and internal receipts. The chairman leaned in again, this time with an edge in his voice that hadn't been there before. Ms. Bondi, do you wish to respond under oath? Bondi didn't answer. She glanced at her attorney seated behind her, who gave the smallest shake of his head. Then let the record show, the chairman said. The witness declines to offer a sworn response at this time. What followed wasn't debate, it was consequence. Members began discussing next steps. Legal referrals, a formal vote on subpoena power, calls for a Department of Justice review. Bondi sat silent, her hands now folded tightly in her lap, eyes locked forward. But her silence was no longer dignified. It was tactical retreat. Jasmine leaned back finally, her job done, for now. But the moment wasn't over. Not yet. Because someone in the gallery, a woman in her 60s, wearing a faded U.S. Army widow's pin, stood up. She wasn't supposed to. Spectators are told to remain silent. But this woman had lost her husband to war and her savings to Trump University. And now she couldn't stay quiet. My son dropped out of school because of you, she called to Bondi, voice shaking. He believed in that program. We believed in it. And you protected a lie. Security moved toward her gently, but Jasmine raised her hand. Let her speak, she said. The room froze. Even the chairman nodded. 1 minute, he said. The woman, her name was Teresa McCall, held up a photo. A young man in military fatigues standing beside a Trump University banner. He wanted to serve. He wanted to build something after service. You took that from him. You stole the future we were trying to build back from grief. She turned to Jasmine. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for fighting back. Jasmine stood, not for attention, but for solidarity. You weren't invisible, she said softly. They just wanted you to be. The room erupted in applause, not loud, but unified, a release of everything that had been sitting under the surface for too long. Outside, the media swarmed. The red folder was now a symbol. The email was a rallying cry. But Jasmine Crockett? She just slipped quietly out the side door, unnoticed by the scrum, her heels clicking on the marble like punctuation marks on a sentence she wasn't done writing. Because this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the moment truth stopped knocking and kicked the door off its hinges. The echo of Jasmine's words still hadn't faded when the chairman's gavel fell again. Not as a return to order, but as a signal that something irreversible had begun. Given the evidence entered into the record and the testimony provided under oath, he said slowly, this committee will now proceed to vote on issuing a formal subpoena for sworn testimony from Ms. Pamela Bondi. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly, each member reached for the small black button on the desk before them. Yes, yes, yes. The screen tallied the votes in real time. The motion passed, 11-1. And just like that, the woman who had once been the top law enforcement official in Florida, who had stood beside presidents and boasted of law and order, now had one thing waiting for her, a subpoena. No longer a guest, no longer a respected former official, a witness under legal compulsion. Pam Bondi didn't react, not outwardly, but the silence around her was no longer deference, it was distance. People who had once leaned in were now leaning back. Staffers who had smiled before were now frozen in place, avoiding eye contact, checking their phones, flipping through papers that didn't matter. Her own legal team had gone pale, eyes darting, whispering behind their hands. because everyone knew this wasn't a political hit. This was a collapse. Quiet, measured, complete. The chairman cleared his throat again. Furthermore, he continued, we are referring this matter to the Department of Justice for formal review of prosecutorial conduct. That was the line. That was the thunder. The entire chamber rippled. Bondi's face remained still, but her shoulders sank, just an inch, but enough, because everyone in that room, and every viewer watching across the country, understood what that sentence meant. It meant this wasn't just about oversight anymore. It was about consequences. In newsrooms from D.C. to Des Moines, red alerts rolled across teleprompters. Bombshell on the Hill, CNN reported. Bureaucratic armor cracked, said Fox. But the most devastating headline came from a retired judge writing on a live blog. He didn't mince words. This is no longer political. This is prosecutorial misconduct, and it demands prosecution. Meanwhile, on the committee floor, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She didn't speak. She didn't celebrate. She just sat there, steady, still, her hands folded on the table, her face calm, her eyes fixed. And that calm was terrifying, because real power doesn't need to scream. It just waits for the truth to hit. Pam Bondi turned, finally, to her microphone. Her voice was brittle, forced through clenched restraint. Due to the emotional toll of this proceeding, she said, and on the advice of counsel, I will be excusing myself from further questioning. She stood, slowly, not defiantly, not with dignity. She rose like someone realizing the ground beneath her reputation was no longer made of marble, but sand. Ms. Bondi, the chairman said, his voice clipped, you are advised that failure to appear under subpoena may result in criminal penalties. She didn't reply. She simply turned away. Not one member of the committee stood to shake her hand. Not one press camera followed her exit. And when she reached the door, something surreal happened. It stuck. For the briefest moment, the door wouldn't open. She jiggled it once. Then it clicked. But that hesitation, that 1 second, was captured by a dozen photographers. It became the image that summed it all up. A woman trying to escape, but no longer sure which way out led to safety. As Bondi vanished behind the door, the room sat still for a moment longer. Then Jasmine finally exhaled, not with relief, but with resolution. She looked to the chairman. Mr. Chairman, she said quietly, I'd like to request we enter the whistleblower memo into public record, not just committee record, but federal archival record. The chairman nodded, his voice suddenly hoarse. Granted. And with that, Jasmine did something no one expected. She stood, reached into her folder, and pulled out a handwritten letter. It was folded once, cream-colored, heavy stock. This letter, she said, was sent to my office by a woman named Gloria, who lost her entire retirement savings to Trump University. She asked me to read this, only if I felt the system had finally opened its ears. She unfolded the paper slowly and began to read. Dear Congresswoman Crockett, my name is Gloria. I am 72 years old. I worked 43 years as a public school teacher and saved every penny in hopes of traveling once I retired. In 2011, I invested in Trump University because I believed the ads. I believed the certificates. I believed in the promise, but it was a lie. And when I called the Florida Attorney General's office to file a complaint, I was told the matter was closed. No explanation, no warning, just silence. I cried for weeks, not because I lost the money, but because I felt invisible. If you're reading this aloud, I want you to know something. I see you, and I thank you, because for the first time, I feel seen too. The room went silent, but it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of grief, of justice remembered too late. And Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't falter. She just folded the letter, held it gently in both hands, and looked at the room. Let this be the last time a voice like hers gets ignored. The audience didn't clap. They stood, quietly, all of them. Even members from the other side of the aisle, not in politics, but in recognition. Outside, the storm had begun. Protesters were gathering. Reporters flooded the Capitol steps. Hashtags were trending. Commentators were scrambling. But Jasmine? She walked out the back again, alone, No entourage, no press pack, just a quiet woman who had spoken loud enough for an entire country to finally hear. In the days that followed, the impact was seismic. Legal analysts called it the Crockett Doctrine, the moment congressional oversight stopped being theater and started being a tool of truth. A coalition of state attorneys general launched internal reviews. Bondi's old cases were reopened. Donors panicked. PACs issued denials. Even quiet staffers in other state offices began leaking memos. Because when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't knock politely. It blows the windows out of every room where injustice once sat protected by silence. And through it all, Jasmine never raised her voice. She never looked for the spotlight. She never made it about her, because it never was. When the committee adjourned, there was no thunder, no riot of applause, no political chants, just silence, so deep it felt sacred. People filed out of room 2141 like mourners leaving a funeral, not of a person, but of an illusion. The illusion that some people in this country would never be touched. That power, wrapped in pearls and paperwork, could always outrun the truth. But not today. Not this time. Jasmine Crockett sat alone at the long oak table. The cameras had stopped filming. The committee members had stepped out. But she remained, a woman unmoved by the noise of what she'd just dismantled. Her fingertips still rested on the closed red folder like it was a gravestone. Not of a person, but of a way of doing business. The folder didn't hold power. It held proof. And that's what shook the nation. Not that Bondi fell, but that she fell to something no one could spin: receipts. Outside, the Capitol steps were chaos. Protesters held signs that read, "No more paid justice," and "Truth doesn't need a donation." One elderly veteran held up a copy of the IRS form Jasmine had introduced, the $25,000 check. He didn't say a word. He just stood there with the form held to his chest, like a flag folded at a funeral. Inside the Capitol, aides whispered nervously. Phones rang with urgency. Office lights stayed on late. Staffers who had once ignored ethics briefings were now requesting transcripts. Something had changed, not in the law, but in the air. And Jasmine? She walked out of the Capitol the same way she had walked in, with steady steps, alone. No press swarm, no celebration, just a woman with work left to do. She didn't make a statement. She didn't need to, because the question had already been asked. And now it was echoing far beyond D.C. Were you the people's prosecutor, or just a private attorney for the wealthy who could pay for protection? That line, sharp as a scalpel, had become scripture overnight. It was printed on protest banners, used in college ethics courses. It was quoted in courtrooms and whispered in churches. Even state attorneys running for office were being asked it in debates. It wasn't just a question, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, the justice system saw its own reflection and flinched. Gloria, the retired school teacher whose letter Jasmine had read, was interviewed on live TV 2 days later. She held up her printed email response from Jasmine's office, a thank you. Her voice trembled as she looked into the camera and said, "I wrote that letter because I didn't know what else to do. I never thought anyone in power would care, but she did. She heard me." Her words weren't dramatic. They were undeniable, because justice, real justice, doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to show up. In state capitals across the country, the tremors kept coming. A district attorney in Arizona resigned after documents surfaced about donation-linked case closures. In Texas, 2 PACs linked to judicial appointments were audited. In New York, a grand jury asked for new testimony in a decade-old campaign finance case. And all of it traced back to one red folder and one question. Were you the people's prosecutor? In law schools, professors rewrote syllabi to include the Crockett hearing. One Yale constitutional scholar said, "She didn't just raise a question, she redefined the courtroom without ever leaving the committee floor." Students wrote essays not about theories, but about clarity, about why accountability feels so rare that when it arrives, it electrifies the air. And in that clarity, Jasmine Crockett became something more than a representative. She became a standard. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of all didn't happen in Washington. It happened in a small church basement in Mississippi. After Sunday service, a group of widows and veterans gathered around a single laptop. They watched the hearing replay together. No popcorn, no talking, just silence. When it ended, no one moved for a full minute. Then one woman said, "I never thought I'd live long enough to see someone stand up in a room like that and not shake." Another added, "She spoke for us, not just for victims, for everyone who's been told their truth is too small to matter." That's what shook the country. Not the fall of Pam Bondi, but the rise of a voice that refused to be small. And still, Jasmine remained silent. No press junket, no late-night TV, no memoir tease. Her staff fielded over 2,400 media requests in 48 hours. She turned them all down. When asked why, she simply said, "The evidence already said everything." Her restraint made the story louder. Her silence made the truth heavier. Because when someone refuses to chase the camera, you start wondering why everyone else always does. Back in Washington, the Office of Congressional Ethics released a statement. "Given the evidence, we are launching a parallel inquiry into potential misuse of prosecutorial discretion by former Attorney General Pamela Bondi." The phrase misuse of prosecutorial discretion is government speak for, "You might want to lawyer up." Bondi's attorneys went dark. Her spokesperson resigned. One former staffer lawyered up and said only, "We all knew it would come someday. We just didn't think it'd be her." But it wasn't just her. It was a culture, one where money whispers louder than victims, where legal decisions follow campaign checks, where silence is currency and the poor are expected to accept it. Jasmine Crockett didn't just rip the curtain. She showed what's behind it. And the nation didn't just watch. It responded. Voters began demanding new oversight standards. Legal watchdog groups raised millions in a single weekend. A bipartisan ethics reform bill named the Crockett Act was introduced, designed to prevent attorney generals from accepting donations linked to active investigations. And for once, no one tried to block it, not publicly, because Jasmine hadn't just won a fight. She'd changed the field, and still, she didn't speak. She walked the halls of Congress like a woman untouched by the noise. She attended hearings, she read briefings, she met with constituents. She kept climbing, not for glory, but for ground, quietly, relentlessly, like someone who had carried truth for so long that she'd stopped asking for applause and started demanding results. 3 weeks later, during a small community town hall in her district, someone finally asked the question, "Why didn't you fight back when Bondi said you were grandstanding?" Jasmine paused. The room fell still. She looked around. Mostly older Americans, church members, retired factory workers. Then she said, "Because when you're speaking for people who've been silenced for decades, you don't waste time defending yourself. You keep the mic on them." There was no applause, just nods. That's all she ever asked for. In the final days of that season's congressional session, Jasmine passed 3 new measures related to PASI transparency and whistleblower protection. They didn't make headlines, but they made change. That's how she worked. While others posed, she built. While others defended themselves, she defended the unseen. And when asked what she hoped the country took from that hearing, she answered with only 7 words. Truth doesn't need volume, just courage. And so the red folder now rests in the National Archives. Beside it, a printed card bearing one question, now etched into congressional history. Were you the people's prosecutor, or just a private attorney for the wealthy who could pay for protection? That question is still echoing. In courthouses, in classrooms, in small-town libraries and dinner tables across the country. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak it. She made the nation answer it. And that's how you change the world. Not with noise, but with a silence that demands a response. If this story moved you, if you believe in truth over power and justice that serves everyone, not just the wealthy, don't let it end here. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who still believes in what America can be. And tell us in the comments, was she the people's prosecutor or just another shield for the elite? Your voice matters, now more than ever.